to Sleepy Time Tales, a podcast aimed at helping you to get a good night's sleep. Do you find your mind troubled with the stresses of modern life, especially when the lights are out and you're trying to get a restful night? Does your spinning mind keep you awake? Follow my voice down the path towards a good night's rest. Listen to me tell a story that will keep your mind from wandering to your daytime problems, the ones you can't solve right now and will be easier to solve while rested. Listen to my voice and allow yourself to drift, following the twists and turns of the story, but slowly letting go and drifting into sleep. Let my voice wash over you at a comfortable volume and allow yourself to be distracted from the stresses and worries that play on your mind. Whether you need help falling asleep or going back to sleep in the middle of the night, you can trust me to keep you company and help you to wake up tomorrow in a rested state. You may need to try out Sleepy Time Tales for a few nights to get used to the slightly strange idea, but I believe it will be well worth your while. I'm here to work with you, to create a safe space, a cocoon in which you can curl up and allow nature to take its course. So settle down, relax, and allow yourself to get lost in my telling of tonight's story. Before we get to tonight's reading, I'd like to ask for a few minutes of your time. Sleepy Time Tales is a purely listener-supported podcast. I can only keep it going, paying for the services and tools that I use, and justify my time thanks to the generosity of listeners like you. So if you're finding Sleepy Time Tales useful, if it helps you to get a restful night, and you would like to keep it going out to thousands of other insomniacs, please consider supporting it on the Patreon at patreon.com/sleepytimetales. This is monthly support that helps me keep the lights on and gets you bonuses based on your contribution level. So go along there, take a look, and sign up if you're interested. And if monthly seems like a big ask, you can, of course, make once-off tips through the tip jar on the website. And another massive way you can help Sleepy Time Tales without having to do anything financial is just tell people about it. If you know someone who's struggling to sleep and you think they'll benefit from listening to little old me, just tell them where to find it. And I think that's enough of that. We are picking up on some list of banned schemes and people falling for scams, which is kind of amazing how even today people fall for basically the same thing. We return this week to Memoirs of Extraordinary Popular Delusions, Volume 1 by Charles Mackay. And we finished last week with a list of companies that were banned by the British government. And we start this week with a whole other list of bubbles banned by the British government. List of bubbles. The following bubble companies were by the same order declared to be illegal and abolished accordingly. 1. For the importation of Swedish iron. 2. For supplying London with sea coal, capital 3 million. 3. For building and rebuilding houses throughout all England, capital 3 million. 4. For making of muslin. 5. For carrying on and improving the British alum works. 6. For effectually settling the island of Blanco and Salta Artagus. 7. For supplying the town of Deal with fresh water. 8. For the importation of Flanders lace. 9. For improvement of lands in Great Britain, capital 4 million. 10. For encouraging the breed of horses in England and improving of glebe and church lands, and for repairing and rebuilding parsonage and vicarage houses. 11. For making of iron and steel in Great Britain. 12. For improving the land in the county of Flint, capital 1 million. 13. For purchasing lands to build on, capital 2 millions. 14. For trading in hair. 15. For erecting salt works in Holy Island, capital 2 million. 16. For buying and selling estates and lending money on mortgage. 17. For carrying on an undertaking of great advantage, but nobody to know what it is. 18. For paving the streets of London, capital 2 million. 19. For furnishing funerals to any part of Great Britain. 20. For buying and selling lands and lending money as interest. Capital, 5 million. 21. For carrying on the royal fishery of Great Britain. Capital, 10 millions. 22. For sharing of seamen's wages. 23. For erecting loan offices for the assistance and encouragement of the industrious. Capital, 2 millions. 24. For purchasing and improving leasable lands. Capital, 4 millions. 25. For importing pitch and tar and other naval stores from North Britain and America. 26. For the clothing, felt, and pantal trade. 27. For purchasing and improving a manor and royalty in Essex. 28. For insuring of horses. Capital, 2 millions. 29. For exporting the woolen manufacture and importing copper, brass, and iron. Capital, 4 millions. 30. For a grand dispensary. Capital, 3 millions. 31. For erecting mills and purchasing lead mines. Capital, 2 millions. 32. For improving the art of making soap. 33. For a settlement on the island of Santa Cruz. 34. For sinking pits and a smelting lead ore in Derbyshire. 35. For making glass bottles and other glass. 36. For a wheel of perpetual motion. Capital, 1 million. 37. For improving of gardens. 38. For ensuring and increasing children's fortunes. 39. For entering and loading goods at the custom house, and for negotiating business for merchants. 40. For carrying on a woolen manufacture in the north of England. 41. For importing walnut trees from Virginia. Capital, 2 millions. 42. For making Manchester stuffs of thread and cotton. 43. For making Joppa and Castile soap. 44. For improving the wrought iron and steel manufactures of this kingdom. Capital, 4 millions. 45. For dealing in lace, hollands, cambrics, lawns, etc. Capital, 2 million. 46. For trading in and improving certain commodities of the produce of this kingdom, etc. Capital, 3 millions. 47. For supplying the London markets with capital. 48. For making looking glasses, coach glasses, etc. Capital, 2 million. 49. For working the tin and lead mines in Cornwall and Derbyshire. 50. For making rape oil. 51. For importing beaver fur. Capital, 2 millions. 52. For making pasteboard and packing paper. 53. For importing of oils and other materials used in the woolen manufacture. 54. For improving and increasing the silk manufactures. 55. For lending money on stock, annuities, tallies, etc. 56. For paying pensions to widows and others at a small discount. Capital, 2 millions. 57. For improving malt liquors. Capital, 4 millions. 58. For grand American fishery. 59. For purchasing and improving the fenny lands in Lincolnshire. Capital, 2 millions. 60. For improving the paper manufacture of Great Britain. 61. The Bottomry Company. 62. For drying malt by hot air. 63. For carrying on a trade in the river Orinoco. 64. For the more effectual making of bays in Colchester and other parts of Great Britain. 65. For buying of naval stores, supplying the victualling and paying the wages of workmen. 66. for employing poor artificers and furnishing merchants and others with watches. 67. For improvement of tillage and the breed of cattle. 68. Another for the improvement of our breed of horses. 69. Another for our horse insurance. 70. For carrying on the corn trade of Great Britain. 71. For ensuring to all masters and mistresses the losses they may sustain by servants. Capital, 3 millions. 72. For erecting houses or hospitals, for taking in and maintaining illegitimate children. Capital, 2 millions. 73. For bleaching coarse sugars without the use of fire or loss of substance. 74. For building turnpikes and wharfs in Great Britain. 75. For insuring from thefts and robberies. 76. For extracting silver from lead. 77. For making China and Delft ware. Capital, 1 million. 78. For importing tobacco and exporting it again to Sweden and the north of Europe. Capital, 4 millions. 79. For making iron with pit coal. 80. For furnishing the cities of London and Westminster with hay and straw. Capital, 3 millions. 81. For a sail and packing cloth manufactory in Ireland. 82. For taking up ballast. 83. For buying and fitting out ships to suppress pirates. 84. For the importation of timber from Wales. Capital, 2 millions. 85. For rock salt. 86. For the transmutation of quicksilver into a malleable fine metal. Besides these bubbles, many others sprang up daily, in spite of the condemnation of the government and the ridicule of the still sane portion of the public. The print shops teemed with caricatures, and the newspapers with epigrams and satires upon the prevalent folly. An ingenious card maker published a pack of South Sea playing cards, which are now extremely rare, each card containing, besides the usual figures, of a very small size in one corner, a caricature of a bubble company, with appropriate verses underneath. One of the most famous bubbles was Puckle's Machine Company, for discharging round and square cannonballs and bullets, and making a total revolution in the art of war. Its pretensions to public favor were thus summed up on the 8 of spades, a rare invention to destroy the crowd of fools at home instead of fools abroad. Fear not, my friends, this terrible machine, they have only wounded those who have shares therein. The 9 of the Hearts was a caricature of the English Copper and Brass Company, with the following epigram: The headlong fool that wants to be a swapper of gold and silver coin for English copper may, in Change Alley, prove himself an arse, and give rich metal for adulterated brass. The 8 of Diamonds celebrated the company for the colonization of Acadia with this doggerel: He that is rich and wants to fool away a good round sum in North America, let him subscribe himself a headlong sharer, and ass's ears shall honor him or bearer. And in a similar style, every card of the pack exposed some knavish scheme, and ridiculed the persons who were its dupes. It was computed that the total amount of the sums proposed for carrying on these projects was upwards of 300 million sterling, a sum so immense that it exceeded the value of all the lands in England at 20 years' purchase. It is time, however, to return to the great South Sea Gulf that swallowed the fortunes of so many thousands of the avaricious and the credulous. On the 29th of May, the stock had risen as high as 500, and about 2/3 of the government annuitants had exchanged the securities of the state for those of the South Sea Company. During the whole of the month of May, the stock continued to rise, and on the 28th it was quoted at 550. In 4 days after this, it took a prodigious leap, rising suddenly from 550 to 890. It was now the general opinion that the stock could rise no higher, and many persons took that opportunity of selling out, with a view of realizing their profits. Many noblemen and persons in the train of the king, and about to accompany him to Hanover, were also anxious to sell out. So many sellers and so few buyers appeared in the alley on the 3rd of June that the stock fell at once from 890 to 640. The directors were alarmed and gave their agents orders to buy. Their efforts succeeded. Towards evening, confidence was restored, and the stock advanced to 750. It continued at this price with some slight fluctuations until the company closed their books on the 22nd of June. It would be needless and uninteresting to detail the various arts employed by the directors to keep up the price of stock. It will be sufficient to state that it finally rose to 1,000%. It was quoted at this price in the commencement of August. The bubble was then full blown and began to quiver and shake, preparatory to its bursting. Many of the government annuitants expressed dissatisfaction against the directors. They accused them of partiality in making out the list for shares in each subscription. Further uneasiness was occasioned by its being generally known that Sir John Blunt, the chairman, and some others had sold out. During the whole of the month of August, the stock fell, and on the 2nd of September it was quoted at 700 only. The state of things now became alarming. To prevent, if possible, the utter extinction of public confidence in their proceedings, the directors summoned a general court of the whole corporation to meet in Merchant Taylor's Hall on the 8th of September. By 9 o'clock in the morning, the room was full to suffocation. Cheapside was blocked up by a crowd unable to gain admittance, and the greatest excitement prevailed. The directors and their friends mustered in great numbers. Sir John Fellows, the sub-governor, was called to the chair. He acquainted the assembly with the cause of their meeting, read to them the several resolutions of the court of directors, and gave them an account of their proceedings, of the taking in the redeemable and unredeemable funds, and of the subscriptions in money. Mr. Secretary Craggs then made a short speech, wherein he commended the conduct of the directors, and urged that nothing could more effectually contribute to bringing the scheme to perfection than union among themselves. He concluded with a motion for thanking the court of directors for their prudent and skillful management, and for desiring them to proceed in such manner as they should think most proper for the interest and advantage of the corporation. Mr. Hungerford, who had rendered himself very conspicuous in the House of Commons for his zeal in behalf of the South Sea Company, and who was shrewdly suspected to have been a considerable gainer by knowing the right time to sell out, was very magniloquent on this occasion. He said he had seen the rise and fall, the decay and resurrection of many communities of this nature, but that in his opinion none had ever performed such wonderful things in so short a time as the South Sea Company. They had done more than the Crown, the pulpit, or the bench could do. They had reconciled all parties in one common interest. They had laid asleep, if not wholly extinguished, all the domestic jars and animosities of the nation. By the rise of their stock, moneyed men had vastly increased their fortunes. Country gentlemen had seen the value of their lands doubled and trebled in their hands. They had at the time done good to the church, not a few of the reverend clergy having got great sums by the project. In short, they had enriched the whole nation, and he hoped that they had not forgotten themselves. There was some hissing at the latter part of this speech, which for the extravagance of its eulogy was not far removed from satire. But the directors and their friends and all the winners in the room applauded vehemently. The Duke of Portland spoke in a similar strain, and expressed his great wonder why anybody should be dissatisfied. Of course, he was a winner by his speculations, and in a condition similar to that of the fat alderman in Joe Miller's jests, who, whenever he had eaten a good dinner, folded his hands upon his porch and expressed his doubts whether there could be a hungry man in the world. Several resolutions were passed at this meeting, but they had no effect upon the public. Upon the very same evening the stock fell to 640, and on the morrow to 540. Day after day it continued to fall until it was as low as 400. In a letter dated September 13th, from Mr. Broderick MP to Lord Chancellor Middleton, and published in Coxo's Walpole, the former says, "Various are the conjectures why the South Sea directors have suffered the cloud to break so early. I make no doubt but they would do so when they found it to their advantage. They have stretched credit so far beyond what it would bear that specie proves insufficient to support it. Their most considerable men have drawn out, securing themselves by the losses of the deluded, thoughtless numbers, whose understandings have been overruled by avarice, and the hope of making mountains out of molehills. Thousands of families will be reduced to beggary. The consternation is inexpressible, the rage beyond description, and the case altogether so desperate that I do not see any plan or scheme so much as thought of for averting the blow, so that I cannot pretend to guess what is next to be done." 10 days afterwards, the stock still falling, he writes, "The company have yet come to no determination. They are in such a wood that they know not which way to turn. By several gentlemen lately come to town, I perceive the very name of a South Sea man grows abominable in every country. A great many goldsmiths already run off, and more will daily. I question whether a 1/3, nay 1/4 of them can withstand it. From the very beginning I founded my judgment of the whole affair upon the unquestionable maximum that 10 millions, which is more than our running cash, could not circulate 200 millions, beyond which our paper credits extended. That, therefore, whenever that should become doubtful, be the cause what it would, a noble state machine must inevitably fall to the ground." On the 12th of September, at the earnest solicitation of Mr. Secretary Craggs, several conferences were held between the directors of the South Sea and the directors of the bank. A report which was circulated that the latter had agreed to circulate 6 millions of the South Sea Company's bonds caused the stock to rise to 670. But in the afternoon, as soon as the report was known to be groundless, the stock fell again to 580. The next day to 570, and so gradually to 400. Gay, the poet, in that disastrous year, had a present from young Craggs of some South Sea stock, and once supposed himself to be master of £20,000. His friends persuaded him to sell his share, but he dreamed of dignity and splendor, and could not bear to obstruct his own fortune. He was then importuned to sell as much as would purchase 100 a year for life, which, says Fenton, will make you sure of a clean shirt and a shoulder of mutton every day. This counsel was rejected, the profit and principal were lost, and Gay sunk under the calamity so low that his life became in danger. Johnson's Lives of the Poets. The ministry was seriously alarmed at the aspect of affairs. The directors could not appear in the streets without being insulted. Dangerous riots were every moment apprehended. Dispatches were sent off to the king at Hanover, praying his immediate return. Mr. Walpole, who was staying in his country seat, was sent for, that he might employ his known influence with the directors of the Bank of England to induce them to accept the proposal made by the South Sea Company for circulating a number of their bonds. The bank was very unwilling to mix itself up with the affairs of the company. It dreaded being involved in calamities which it could not relieve, and received all overtures with visible reluctance. But the universal voice of the nation called upon it to come to the rescue. Every person of note in commercial politics was called in to advise in the emergency. A rough draft of a contract, drawn up by Mr. Walpole, was ultimately adopted as the basis of further negotiations, and the public alarm abated a little. On the following day, the 20th of September, a general court of the South Sea Company was held at Merchant Taylor's Hall, in which resolutions were carried, empowering the directors to agree with the Bank of England, or any other persons, to circulate the company's bonds, or make any other agreement with the bank, as they should think proper. One of the speakers, a Mr. Pulteney, said it was most surprising to see the extraordinary panic which had seized upon the people. Men were running to and fro in alarm and terror, their imaginations filled with some great calamity, the form and dimensions of which nobody knew. At a general court of the Bank of England held 2 days afterwards, the governor informed them of the several meetings that had been held on the affairs of the South Sea Company, adding that the directors had not yet thought fit to come to any decision upon the matter. A resolution was then proposed and carried without a dissentient voice, empowering the directors to agree with those of the South Sea to circulate their bonds, to what sum and upon what terms, and for what time they might think proper. Thus both parties were at liberty to act as they might judge best for the public interest. Books were opened at the bank for a subscription of 3 millions for the support of public credit, on the usual terms of £15 per cent deposited and £5 per cent interest. So great was the concourse of people in the early part of the morning, all eagerly bringing their money, that it was thought the subscription would be full that day. But before noon the tide turned. In spite of all that could be done to prevent it, the South Sea Company's stock fell rapidly. Their bonds were in such discredit that a run commenced upon the most eminent goldsmiths and bankers, some of whom, having lent out great sums upon South Sea stock, were obliged to shut up their shops and abscond. The Swordblade Company, who had hitherto been the chief cashiers of the South Sea Company, stopped payment. This being looked upon as but the beginning of evil, occasioned a great run upon the bank, who were now obliged to pay out money much faster than they had received it upon the subscription in the morning. The day succeeding was a holiday, the 29th of September, and the bank had a little breathing time. They bore up against the storm, but their former rivals, the South Sea Company, were wrecked upon it. Their stock fell to 150, and gradually, after various fluctuations, to 135. The bank, finding they were not able to restore public confidence and stem the tide of ruin without running the risk of being swept away with those they intended to save, declined to carry out the agreement into which they had partially entered. They were under no obligation whatever to continue, for the so-called bank contract was nothing more than the rough draft of an agreement, in which blanks had been left for several important particulars, and which contained no penalty for their succession. And thus, to use the words of the parliamentary history, was seen in the space of 8 months the rise, progress, and fall of that mighty fabric, which being wound up by mysterious springs to a wonderful height, had fixed the eyes and expectations of all Europe. But his foundation, being fraud, illusion, credulity, and infatuation, fell to the ground as soon as the artful management of its directors was discovered. In the heyday of its blood, during the progress of this dangerous delusion, the manners of the nation became sensibly corrupted. The parliamentary inquiry set on foot to discover the delinquents disclosed scenes of infamy, disgraceful alike to the morals of the offenders and the intellects of the people among whom they had arisen. It is a deeply interesting study to investigate all the evils that were the result. Nations, like individuals, cannot become desperate gamblers with impunity. Punishment is sure to overtake them sooner or later. The celebrated writer, Smollett, is quite wrong when he says that such an era as this is the most unfavorable for a historian, that no reader of sentiment and imagination can be entertained or interested by detail of transactions such as these, which admit of no warmth, no coloring, no embellishment, a detail of which only serves to exhibit an inanimate picture of tasteless vice and mean degeneracy. On the contrary, and Smollett might have discovered it if he had been in the humor, the subject is capable of inspiring as much interest as even a novelist can desire. Is there no warmth in the despair of a plundered people? No life and animation in the picture which might be drawn of the woes of hundreds of impoverished and ruined families, of the wealthy of yesterday becoming the beggars of today, of the powerful and influential changing into exiles and outcasts, and the voice of self-reproach and imprecation resounding from every corner of the land? Is it a dull or uninstructive picture to see a whole people shaking suddenly off the trammels of reason and running wild after a golden vision, refusing obstinately to believe that it is not real, till, like a deluded hind running in an ignis fatuus, they are plunged into a quagmire? But in this false spirit has history too often been written. The intrigues of unworthy courtiers to gain the favor of still more unworthy kings, or the records of murderous battles and sieges have been dilated on and told over and over again, with all the eloquence of style and the charms of fancy. All the circumstances which have most deeply affected the morals and welfare of the people have been passed over with but slight notice as dry and dull, incapable of neither warmth nor coloring. During the progress of this famous bubble, England presented a singular spectacle. The public mind was in a state of unwholesome fermentation. Men were no longer satisfied with the slow but sure profits of cautious industry. The hope of boundless wealth for the morrow made them heedless and extravagant for day to day. A luxury till then unheard of was introduced, bringing in its train a corresponding laxity of morals. The overbearing insolence of ignorant men had risen to sudden wealth by successful gambling, made men of true gentility of mind and manners blush that gold should have power to raise the unworthy in the scale of society. The haughtiness of some of these ciphering cits, as they were termed by Sir Richard Steele, was remembered against them in the day of their adversity. In the parliamentary inquiry, many of the directors suffered more for their insolence than for their speculation. One of them, who in the full-grown pride of an ignorant rich man had said he would feed his horse upon gold, was reduced almost to bread and water for himself. Every haughty look, every overbearing speech was set down and repaid them 100-fold in poverty and humiliation. The state of matters all over the country was so alarming that George I shortened his intended stay in Hanover and returned in all haste to England. He arrived on the 11th of November, and Parliament was summoned to meet on the 8th of December. In the meantime, public meetings were held in every considerable town of the empire, at which petitions were adopted, praying the vengeance of the legislature upon the South Sea directors, who, by their fraudulent practices, had brought the nation to the brink of ruin. Nobody seemed to imagine that the nation itself was as culpable as the South Sea Company. Nobody blamed the credulity and avarice of the people, the degrading lust of gain which had swallowed up every nobler quality in the national character, or the infatuation which had made the multitude run their heads with such frantic eagerness into the net held out for them by scheming projectors. These things were never mentioned. The people were a simple, honest, hard-working people, ruined by a gang of robbers who were to be hanged, drawn, and quartered without mercy. This was the almost unanimous feeling of the country. The two houses of Parliament were not more reasonable. Before the guilt of the South Sea directors was known, punishment was the only cry. The king, in his speech from the throne, expressed his hope that they would remember that all their prudence, temper, and resolution were necessary, to find out and apply the proper remedy for their misfortunes. In the debate on the answer to the address, several speakers indulged in the most violent invectives against the directors of the South Sea project. Lord Molesworth was particularly vehement. It had been said by some that there was no law to punish the directors of the South Sea Company, who were justly looked upon as the authors of the present misfortunes of the state. In his opinion, they ought upon this occasion to follow the example of the ancient Romans, who, having no law against parricide, because their legislators supposed no son could be so unnaturally wicked as to imbue his hands in his father's blood, made a law to punish this heinous crime as soon as it was committed. They adjudged the guilty wretch to be sown in a sack and thrown alive into the Tiber. He looked upon the contrivers and executives of the villainous South Sea scheme as the parricides of their country, and should be satisfied to see them tied in like manner in sacks and thrown into the Thames. Other members spoke with as much want of temper and discretion. Mr. Walpole was more moderate. He recommended that their first care should be to restore public credit. If the city of London were on fire, all wise men would aid in extinguishing the flames and preventing the spread of the conflagration before they inquired after the incendiaries. Public credit had received a dangerous wound and lay bleeding, and they ought to apply a speedy remedy to it. It was time enough to punish the assassin afterwards. On the 9th of December, an address in answer to His Majesty's speech was agreed upon after an amendment, which was carried without a division, that words should be added expressive of the determination of the House, not only to seek a remedy for the national distresses, but to punish the authors of them. The inquiry proceeded rapidly. The directors were ordered to lay before the House a full account of all their proceedings. Resolutions were passed to the effect that the calamity was mainly owing to the vile arts of stock jobbers, and that nothing could tend more to the re-establishment of public credit than a law to prevent this infamous practice. Mr. Walpole then rose and said that, as he had previously hinted, he had spent some time upon a scheme of restoring public credit, but that the execution of it depending upon a position which had been laid down as fundamental, he thought it proper, before he opened out his scheme, to be informed whether he might rely upon that foundation. It was whether the subscription of public debts and encumbrances, money subscriptions and other contracts made with the South Sea Company should remain in the present state. This question occasioned an animated debate. It was finally agreed by a majority of 259 against 117 that all these contracts should remain in their present state, and is altered for the relief of the proprietors by General Court of the South Sea Company, or set aside by due course of law. On the following day, Mr. Walpole laid before a committee of the whole House his scheme for the restoration of public credit, which was, in substance, to engraft 9 millions of South Sea stock into the Bank of England, and the same sum into the East India Company upon certain conditions. The plan was favourably received by the House. After some few objections, it was ordered that proposals should be received from the two great corporations. They were both unwilling to lend their aid, and the plan met with a warm but fruitless opposition at the General Courts, summoned for the purpose of deliberating upon it. They, however, ultimately agreed upon the terms on which they would consent to circulate the South Sea bonds, and their report being presented to the committee, a bill was brought in, under the superintendence of Mr. Walpole, and safely carried through both Houses of Parliament. And halfway through setting up this bill, we are going to call it a night. As always, if you would like to pick up where I'm leaving off, you can find the original on Project Gutenberg at the link in the show notes. Thanks again for joining me on this episode of Sleepy Time Tales, the podcast designed around a bedtime story to help you to get a restful night. New episodes will be released every Sunday night to give you something fresh to help you rest in a new week. But make sure to follow or subscribe in whatever service you use so that you get your new episodes whenever they come out. good night and sweet dreams.